Battles of World War II. To learn about the major military events of World War II. Dunkirk, May 27th to June 4th, 1940. Germany began pushing French troops back towards the sea. French soldiers managed to get to Dunkirk, along the French coast, where a massive evacuation of the French troops by the British began. 215,000 British and 120,000 French soldiers were rescued from death or imprisonment. Unfortunately, all supplies had to be left behind. The Battle of Britain, July 10, 1940. Operation Sea Lion. That was the German code name for the attack of Britain. Britain was in dire straits because many supplies had been lost at Dunkirk. Prime Minister Churchill sent out pleas for large quantities of old rifles and ammunition. Reich Marshal Hermann Göring, commander of the German Air Force or Luftwaffe, was sent on a bombing campaign to soften up the British defenses. This became known as the Battle of Britain and is one of the most famous battles of World War II. The Germans underestimated the British and they refused to surrender. Britain was able to hold the Germans. Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion in the late fall of 1940 until the following spring. Canadian pilots in the Royal Canadian Air Force hammered German forces from the skies. Canadians also attacked and sunk German U-boats gathered in wolf packs. War on the Eastern Front, June 22, 1941, Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa. Hitler disregarded the non-aggression pact and invaded the Soviet Union under the code name Operation Barbarossa. Hitler had now fallen into a trap of a two-front war. Why did Hitler invade the Soviet Union and create a two-front war? A. Oil. B. Grain reserves in the Ukraine. C. Racist and hatred for Soviets. D. Hatred for Soviet Jews. And E. Lebensraum, living room. Two of Germany's three attacking armies were successful, and the Germans had almost reached Leningrad and Moscow by December 1941, but the Soviets mounted counterattacks in 1942. Raid on Dieppe, August 1942. In August 1942, Canadian and British troops were sent to Dieppe along the French coast to test the German forces. This was called Operation Jubilee. At 4:50 a.m. on August 19th, 5,000 Canadians landed at the Dieppe beach, but the Germans were waiting and from a cliff mowed down the Allied troops as they left the landing crafts. 900 Canadians were killed, 1,000 wounded, and 1,900 prisoners of war, or POWs. Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The Japanese believed if they destroyed the American fleet, it would allow for Japanese expansion in the Pacific. On December 7, 1941, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, an American naval base in Hawaii, bringing the United States into the war. Canada joined its allies and declared war on Japan. Because the European nations were focused on Hitler and Mussolini, Japan had been quickly overtaking European colonies in Asia. Hong Kong was an important British colony. Canadians were assigned to defend it, along with British and Indian troops. Unfortunately, after 17 days of fighting, the Hong Kong forces had to surrender to the Japanese. There were 290 Canadian soldiers lost and 500 wounded. All survivors were transferred to Japanese prison camps. Ortona was the Italian campaign of July 1943. July 10, 1943, Canadian, British, and American forces made an assault on Sicily from the sea. This was called Operation Husky. In Italy was called the soft underbelly of Europe. American, British, and Canadian troops landed in Sicily and progressed very quickly as the Italian army was demoralized. Canadian army had a major role in the Italian campaign. It was a tough battle, and the Allied forces were able to defeat the fascists. At Ortona, Canadians were forced to take the town street by street and house by house using a technique called mouse holing. After taking one house, they blasted a hole in the neighboring house. Once inside, they poured grenades and machine gun fire on the enemy until the house was taken. Mouse holing was a slow process, but it was successful. At the end of the battle, most of the town was in ruin, with Canadian losses around 2,400 men. D-Day, June 6, 1944. Canadian, American, and British troops landed on the French shores of Normandy and mounted a huge attack to defeat Germany. This was called D-Day. D-Day began with 2,000 bombers attacking the German forces along the French coast of Normandy. Air raids were joined by troops crossing the English Channel by sea crafts to land on 5 different beaches simultaneously. D-Day was to be the largest Allied invasion and Canadian invasion in World War II. Casualties were high, but within a week, Allied forces had 300,000 troops on shore, and within a month, 1 million Allied troops had landed with 200,000 military vehicles. Nazi forces fought hard, but Hitler now was caught with a war on 2 fronts. Fighting continued for 11 months as Allied forces moved forward to Italy and into Germany. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union also advanced towards Germany, and by April 1945, Soviet troops had reached Berlin. Hitler learned that Mussolini had been captured and hanged in Rome by Italians. On April 30th, 1944, Hitler shot himself rather than face the consequences. On May 8th, the fighting in Europe was over. VE Day was May 1945. Hong Kong, the War in the Pacific, 1944 to 1945. The war in the Pacific raged between the American and British forces against Japan. The Americans used an island hopping strategy to dislodge the Japanese troops, but American casualties were high. The Japanese strongly resisted despite the inevitability of defeat and used kamikaze pilots to attack U.S. naval ships. In July, President Roosevelt died and Harry S. Truman became the next president of the U.S. By August 1945, the U.S. had perfected the atomic bomb. On August 6, 1945, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. Japan does not surrender. On August 9, 1945, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Japan. Japan surrenders. This was called VJ Day, September 2nd, 1945.